In 2025, Florida executed 19 death row inmates. Combined, they spent a total of 602 years on death row. Until then, Florida's highest number of executions in a single year had been 8 back in 2014. So in 2025, that record wasn't just broken, it was more than doubled. One of the prisoners executed was Glen Rogers, a man whose name had haunted headlines for decades. Glen became known nationwide as the so-called cross-country killer after being linked to a series of murders across multiple states in the mid-1990s. However, he once told the police he had killed about 70 people in total. In Florida, he was convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs. 2 days after Tina vanished, police found her body in room 119 of the Tampa 8 Inn. She lay face down in the bathtub, blood splattered across the tile. Someone had stabbed her multiple times, both front and back. Witnesses remembered seeing her with a man, Glen Rogers, and one clerk said Glen walked out of the room alone, told them not to clean just yet, and left the "Do Not Disturb" sign hanging on the knob. Then he vanished in Tina's white Ford Festiva. But Glen's trail wasn't as clean as he thought. Investigators in several states began connecting the dots: California, Mississippi, and now Florida. The same pattern, the same man. Because this wasn't the only woman Glen had murdered. Glen was fit, confident, and quick with stories. He danced, he bought drinks, and he made sure everyone noticed him. "He was picking us out like oranges," one of the women later said, and she was right, in more ways than one. Every woman Glen had targeted so far had something in common. They all had red hair, just like his mother. On the night of September 28, 1995, in Van Nuys, California, Glen crossed paths with Sandra Gallagher at a bar. She was 33, a mother of 3, lucky, and ready to celebrate a $1,250 lottery win. But from across the room, Glen wasn't celebrating. He was watching her. Glen always watched, not for beauty, but for weakness. He studied body language, searching for cracks. A woman who held herself with confidence, he'd pass. But someone with softer shoulders, a tired smile, maybe a little too trusting. That's who he was waiting for. And Sandra didn't see it coming. By the time she stepped onto the dance floor, Glen had already made his choice. They left together, and just hours later, her body was found inside her burning truck. She had been raped and strangled to death, and the fire was only set to cover up the crime. But by the time Sandra Gallagher's body was found, Glen was already in Jackson, Mississippi. He kept a low profile, avoided using his real name, and skipped bars where he might be recognized. A federal warrant was already out for him, but he didn't know it yet. In Jackson, Glen drifted from one cheap motel to the next, and in early October, just weeks after Sandra's murder, Glen showed up at the Mississippi State Fair. And that's where he met Linda Price. Linda was 34, a single mother of 2 teenage children, and a rough history when it came to men. But Glen didn't look like trouble, at least not at first. He was charming, easy to talk to, and knew exactly what to say. Within days of meeting, he moved in with her. Then, on November 3rd, everything went silent. Linda's family started to worry. She hadn't called, hadn't visited, and wasn't answering the phone. And when they couldn't reach her, they called the police and asked for a welfare check. What officers found inside was horrific. Linda was lying face down in the bathtub, naked and submerged in shallow water. Her body showed 4 deep stab wounds, 2 in the chest, 2 in the back, and her throat had been slashed. Her red Datsun pickup was gone, and so were her purse, jewelry, and the man she'd been living with. He ended up in Bossier City, Louisiana, a quiet suburb outside Shreveport. There, in a local bar, he struck up a conversation with 37-year-old Andy Sutton. They talked, hit it off, and by the end of the night, she invited him home. But just like that, he left, and no one knows why. Glen boarded another bus and headed south to Florida. In Tampa, he checked into a room at the Tampa 8 Inn and paid for 3 nights in cash. 2 days later, Tina Marie Cribbs was found dead in that exact same motel room. America's Most Wanted aired a segment featuring his face, and newspapers across the country picked up the story. Detectives canvassed carnival sites around Tampa, hoping one of the workers might have seen him. But for a while, Glen stayed ahead. He circled back to Louisiana, back to Andy Sutton. She had missed him, and when he showed up again, she welcomed him without hesitation. They went out drinking, going from one bar to another, laughing like nothing had changed. People remembered how well he treated her. He smiled, joked, and fit in so easily. No one suspected what was coming. That changed on the morning of November 9th, when Andy's roommate came home to a nightmare. Andy was lying across a leaking waterbed, blood soaking into the mattress. The wounds were brutal. Her chest had been torn open with a large blade, and the autopsy later found 6 more stab wounds in her back. And once again, Glen was gone. He had waited until the roommate fell asleep on the couch before making his move. She didn't hear a thing, only noticed her purse missing when she woke. But outside, neighbors spotted Glen loading up a car, the same one he had stolen from his last victim in Florida. And within hours, Louisiana added its name to the growing list of states searching for Glen Rogers. That same day, November 9, 1995, police finally caught up with him in Kentucky. He was still behind the wheel of Tina's white Ford Festiva, probably trying to hunt down his next victim. But when the police attempted to pull him over, he took off. What followed was a 13-mile chase across the highway until a trooper finally rammed his vehicle off the road. Glen was dragged from the car and arrested. His run was over. In 1997, he stood trial for Tina's murder in Florida and was sentenced to death. 2 years later, California put him on trial for the murder of Sandra. The result was the same, another death sentence. And with that, Glen Rogers became one of the few men in U.S. history facing execution in 2 different states. On May 15, 2025, after spending 28 years on death row, Glen Rogers was executed. That morning, Glen woke up at 3:45 a.m. For his final meal, he requested a pizza, chocolate cake, and a soda. He also had one last visit from his wife. I have looked into this, but further details about his wife and their relationship aren't available in any public records. Later that day, he was strapped to the gurney. When asked for any last words, Glen looked toward the witnesses and spoke directly to those he loved: his wife, his brothers, his sons, his grandchildren, and a close friend who had helped with his final appeals. Then, turning to the victims' families, he said, "I know there's a lot of questions that you need answers to. I promise you in the near future the questions will be answered, and I hope in some way will bring you closure," he said. "President Trump, keep making America great. I'm ready to go." Then the drugs began to flow. Glen lay still as the lethal injection started. Within 2 minutes, his eyes closed and his mouth fell open. As the process continued, his face slowly turned pale. At one point, a staff member grasped him by the shoulders, shook him, and yelled, "Rogers, Rogers," checking for any sign of consciousness. There was none. Glen Rogers was pronounced dead at 6:16 p.m. He was 62 years old. But Glen wasn't the first prisoner Florida executed in 2025. That moment came earlier in the year when James Ford was executed after spending 26 long years on death row. But what did he do? On April 6, 1997, James lured his co-worker and his wife, Greg and Kimberly Malnery, to a fish farm in Charlotte County, Florida, under the pretense of a fishing trip. Once they arrived, James attacked them. He shot Greg in the head, then bludgeoned and slit his throat. Kimberly managed to secure their 2-year-old daughter in the backseat of their truck before trying to flee. But James caught her, sexually assaulted her, and then brutally took her life with a rifle. This all happened while her daughter was watching. The following day, farm workers found the couple's bodies, and their daughter was discovered alive in the truck, dehydrated and covered in her mother's blood. She was taken to a hospital and survived. James was arrested almost 2 weeks later, on April 17, 1997, after investigators linked him to the crime. He initially claimed he had left the couple at the farm to go hunting alone, but his story was inconsistent, and multiple witnesses confirmed he was with them before their deaths. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, robbery, sexual battery, and child abuse. In May 1997, prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty, and he was sentenced in February 1999. James tried to appeal the death sentence, but these were denied. His execution was scheduled for February 13th at Florida State Prison. That day, he woke up at 3:30 a.m. and met with 3 family members and his legal team one last time. For his final meal, he requested steak, macaroni and cheese, fried okra, sweet potato, pumpkin pie, and sweet tea. When the warden asked if he had any last words, James didn't say a thing. Strapped to the gurney with around 25 witnesses watching, he stared ahead in silence. But earlier, he had left behind a short handwritten note. Hugs, prayers, love. God bless everyone. At first, as the injection began, his chest began heaving, and then slowly all movements faded. A few minutes later, a staffer shook him and yelled, "Ford! Ford!" to see if he was still conscious. But there was no response. At 6:19 p.m., James was pronounced dead. James Dennis Ford was 64 years old. A month later, on March 20th, 2025, Florida scheduled their next execution. Edward Thomas James was executed by lethal injection after spending nearly 3 decades on death row. But what did he do? On the night of September 19th, 1993, Eddie showed up at a house party just 2 blocks from where he was staying. He drank, laughed, and blended in like nothing was wrong. And by 10:30 p.m., he was clearly drunk. After most of the guests had gone home, he refused a ride and told everyone he was fine. But he wasn't. Before he went home, he used 10 hits of LSD. Then he kept moving, and by the time Eddie walked through Betty Dick's front door, something in him had already turned. Betty was his mother figure and his landlord. And inside the house, she and 4 of her grandchildren were sound asleep. After he stepped inside, he wrapped his hands around Toni Neuner's neck and squeezed. Eventually, he let go, thinking she was dead. He then dragged her to his room, undressed her, assaulted her, and pushed her between the bed and the wall. Toni didn't scream. She never woke up, and she slowly suffocated. But still, Eddie wasn't finished. He burst into Betty's bedroom and hit her with a candlestick. She woke up and screamed, "Why, Eddie, why?" But he kept hitting her. 9-year-old Wendy woke up and ran in, only to see her grandmother being stabbed. When he was done, he took a shower, packed his bags, and stole Betty's purse, jewelry, and car. And by the time police found the bodies, Eddie was gone. For nearly 3 weeks, he stayed on the run until a viewer of America's Most Wanted spotted him in Bakersfield, California. He was arrested on the spot, and on August 18, 1995, Eddie was sentenced to death. On March 20, 2025, inside Florida State Prison, the state carried out his execution. Eddie had no visitors on the last day of his life and gave no final statement. His last meal was fried catfish, potato salad, hush puppies, cookies, soda, and coffee. He died at 8:15 p.m. At 63 years old, Edward Thomas James was pronounced dead. 2 weeks later, the next execution took place. On April 8, 2025, Michael A. Tanzi was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison after spending more than 25 years on death row. Let's take a look at what he did to end up there. On April 25, 2000, Janet Acosta parked her maroon van at a quiet Japanese garden in Miami. She was on her lunch break, looking for peace. She had a book in her lap, and the window was rolled down, just a moment to herself. But what she didn't know was that Michael was watching. He was broke, stranded, and angry, desperate for a ride back to Key West. Initially, he asked her for a cigarette, but when she turned to answer him, he punched her in the face and shoved his way into the van. Holding a razor blade, he forced her to drive. South, farther from help, farther from home. By the time they reached Homestead, he had tied her up, stuffed a towel in her mouth, and whispered in her ear that if she screamed, he'd slice her throat. He emptied her wallet, $53, and used it to buy cigarettes and a drink. Then, in a parking lot, he assaulted her with a blade to her throat. By sunset, they reached Blimp Road, a secluded and silent spot, and there he told her that she wasn't going home. He looped a rope around her neck and pulled, and when her gasps grew too loud, he taped her mouth, her nose, and even her eyes. Then he pulled again, harder, until her body stopped moving. But police were already tracking her ATM withdrawals, and just 2 days later, they arrested him as he returned to Janet's van. Eventually, Michael Tanzi pleaded guilty to every charge, including first-degree murder, and in February 2003, he was sentenced to death. On April 8, 2025, Michael Tanzi was strapped to a gurney inside Florida State Prison. According to prison officials, he woke up at 4:45 a.m. and had one visitor, a spiritual advisor. For his last meal, Michael requested a pork chop, bacon, corn, ice cream, and a candy bar. When asked if he had any final words, Michael spoke in a barely audible voice. He said, "I want to apologize to the family," and then recited a verse from the Bible before the drugs began flowing. Once the 3-drug protocol began, his chest rose and fell for about 3 minutes, then stopped. A corrections officer shook him by the shoulders and called his name twice to check for consciousness. He did not respond. After almost 25 years on death row, Michael A. Tanzi was pronounced dead at 6:12 p.m. He was 48 years old. The next execution took place in May. On May 1, 2025, after spending more than 20 years on death row, Jeffrey Glen Hutchinson was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But what did he do? On the night of September 11, 1998, in a quiet neighborhood in Crestview, Florida, 4 lives were wiped out in just minutes. Inside a modest home, a woman and her 3 children were shot in the head, execution style. There was no struggle, no warning, and no mercy. And the killer wasn't a stranger. It was Jeffrey Hutchinson, a former Army Ranger Gulf War veteran, and the man who lived with them. He was Renee Flaherty's boyfriend, the same guy who helped her raise her kids, Jeffrey, Amanda, and Logan. They trusted him, and then one night, he murdered them. Earlier that evening, nothing seemed off, until Jeffrey and Renee got into a fight, a bad one. Afterward, Jeffrey had packed some things, grabbed his guns, and left. Renee thought it was over, but it wasn't. Jeffrey went to a nearby bar and started drinking, ranting to the bartender about needing to cool off. But instead, he got back in his truck with his shotgun beside him and drove home. He shot Renee first, 1 round to the head. Then he moved through the house like a soldier clearing rooms, and he killed everyone inside. Then, like it was routine, Jeffrey called 911. "I just shot my family," he said, and he was arrested on the scene. At trial, the jury didn't see a man broken by war. They saw a man who picked up a gun and killed the people who loved him. And in 2001, they found him guilty of all 4 murders and sentenced him to death. Jeffrey's execution was scheduled for May 1, 2025. For his final meal, he requested salmon, mahi-mahi, asparagus, baked potato, and iced tea. He had 3 visitors that day, including his sister and a spiritual advisor. That evening, he was led into the death chamber and strapped to the gurney. When asked if he had any final words, he said nothing. But as the process began, witnesses saw his lips move, soft, almost inaudible, as if he were talking to himself or whispering a prayer. His legs shook sporadically, and he seemed to have body spasms for several minutes before falling still. The process took a little more than 15 minutes. He was declared dead at 8:15 p.m. Jeffrey Hutchinson was 62 years old. Then came Anthony Wainwright, who was executed on June 10, 2025, after spending 30 years on death row. He woke up around 3:30 a.m. inside Florida State Prison. Officials offered him a last meal, but he politely declined. According to the Reverend, Anthony was very afraid of what was coming. But what did he do to end up on death row? It all started on April 27, 1994, when Carmen Gayhart didn't show up to pick up her 2 kids from daycare. She was 23 years old, a nursing student in Lake City, Florida, and a mother of 2 young children aged 5 and 3. But that afternoon, she disappeared without a trace. Just 2 days before Carmen vanished, Anthony Wainwright and Richard Hamilton broke out of a minimum security prison in North Carolina. One was doing time for burglary, the other for armed robbery. But they weren't interested in finishing their sentences. They stole a Cadillac, broke into a home, grabbed 2 rifles, and headed south toward Florida, armed, reckless, and already on the edge of violence. In Lake City, their stolen car gave out, overheated and useless. That's when they saw Carmen, 23 years old, loading groceries into her Bronco in a Winn-Dixie parking lot. They pulled a gun and forced her into the vehicle. Hours later, deep in the woods behind a truck stop, both men raped her. And afterward, Anthony strangled her with his bare hands, then shot her twice in the head. Insurance, in his words. They left her in the dirt like she was nothing and drove off in her car. The next day, a state trooper spotted the Bronco in Mississippi. In custody, they talked, but both blamed the other one for the killing. But where was the body? Eventually, Richard drew a map to the location where they dumped the body, and on May 2nd, deputies found Carmen's body, decomposed, discarded, and buried under brush. Her hyoid bone was broken, and her teeth were scattered in the dirt. It confirmed what investigators already feared. Carmen had fought for her life and lost. Back in Florida, prosecutors offered Anthony a deal, no death penalty if he told the full truth and passed a polygraph. But after 2 weeks of interviews, he finally admitted to the and refused the test. Then came the DNA results. His fluid was found in Carmen's car. The deal was gone. In May 1995, both men were convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. 2 juries, 2 death sentences, and not once did either of them show remorse. Then, on January 13, 2023, the case quietly closed for one of them. Richard Hamilton died in prison of natural causes at the age of 59. The official cause of death was never made public, but after nearly 30 years on death row, his time ran out before the state ever carried out the sentence. Then came Anthony's final day. While strapped to the gurney, he was asked if he had any final words. Anthony turned to the victim's family first. "I hope my death brings you peace and healing," he said. But then his tone shifted. He called his court-appointed attorney Florida's worst and said the justice system in the state was broken beyond repair. "Please continue the fight," he told those opposing the death penalty, "because I can promise you they are not going to let up. They will continue to murder if we continue to let it happen." Most of his final words, though, were for his fiancée Samantha, the woman who had taken his last name, even though they were never legally married. "You are the love of my life. I'm so blessed we found each other," he told her. "The years we have spent together have been beyond wonderful. They have been downright magical. Love is stronger than death, and I know our love will last for eternity." The drugs started flowing at 6:10 p.m. Anthony's shoulders shuddered once, then again. He blinked hard, pulled in a few sharp breaths, then stopped moving altogether. By 6:14, he lay completely still. At 6:22 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Anthony Floyd Wainwright was 54 years old. 2 weeks later, Florida scheduled their next execution. On June 24, 2025, after more than 30 years on death row, Thomas Lee Gudinas was executed. Let's look at what got him on death row in the first place. On May 23, 1994, Thomas vanished into the night after bar hopping through Orlando with friends. But while his roommates wrapped up their evening at Barbarella's nightclub, Thomas disappeared. Around 2 a.m., 22-year-old Michelle McGrath left the same club to get her car, but she never made it. Her fiancé searched, but the lot was silent. The next morning, a school staffer found her body crumpled behind a brick wall near the Pace School, naked, lifeless, and discarded like trash. At nearly the same time, a man flagged down a cop nearby to report a strange pile of clothing beside a red Geo Metro. But by then, Thomas had already fled the scene, driving off in Michelle's stolen car. Another woman, Rochelle Smith, had narrowly escaped a similar attack at the same club just an hour before Michelle. When she saw news of the killing, she went straight to police and identified Thomas from a photo lineup. Another witness did the same, and Thomas's roommates, horrified by what they saw when he came home, bloodied with raw knuckles and torn-up hands, told detectives everything. Then came the forensic evidence. His DNA on Michelle's body, his fingerprints on the car and alley gate, and his own words, cold, explicit confessions of and The jury didn't hesitate, and in June 1995, Thomas was sentenced to death. He also received multiple life sentences. Florida made it official. He would never walk free again. On June 24, 2025, his final day came. That morning, Thomas woke up at 4:45 a.m. alone with his thoughts. He had just one visitor that day, his mother. No spiritual advisor, no final prayers, just silence and the slow ticking of time. For his last meal, Thomas requested a pepperoni pizza, fries, and a soda. When the curtain to the execution room opened at 6 p.m., Thomas already lay strapped to a gurney with an IV in his left arm, wearing a plain white shirt and dark pants. From a distance, he looked calm, with healthy color in his skin and no visible signs of fear or pain. When the curtain rose, Thomas was already scanning the witness room, his eyes moving slowly and his head turning just slightly. There was no spiritual advisor at his side. The warden finished his call with the governor's office and leaned in. He asked if Thomas had any final words. The microphone was too far away, and the hum of the air conditioning was too loud, so no one in the witness chamber could make out what he said. But a prison spokesman later shared that Thomas had made a quiet repentance and mentioned the name of Jesus. When the drugs began to flow, Thomas's eyes began to roll back and his breathing shortened. After several minutes, he lost color in his face and fell still. He appeared unconscious. The signal was given, and then came the next 2 doses. After this, the prison warden announced that the sentence had been carried out. At 6:13 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Thomas Lee Gudinas was 51 years old. In July, Florida scheduled 2 executions. The first prisoner executed was Michael Bell. But to understand how he ended up on death row in the first place, we have to go back to a cold December night in 1993. It started outside a Jacksonville liquor lounge. Mike was out for blood. Just 5 months earlier, his brother Lamar had been shot and killed by a man named Theodore Wright. The court called it self-defense, but Mike didn't care. He told anyone who would listen he was going to settle the score. And he meant it. He got his hands on an AK-47, a full clip, and 160 rounds of ammo, supplied by his girlfriend Erica. On December 9th, he spotted a yellow Plymouth parked outside the lounge and believed it belonged to Theodore, but Theodore had sold it. Inside were 3 young people who had nothing to do with Lamar's death. 22-year-old Jimmy West, Theodore's half-brother, 18-year-old Tamika Smith, and one of her friends. But Mike didn't know that, and he didn't care to check. He pulled on a mask, raised the rifle, and opened fire. 12 bullets ripped into Jimmy, killing him instantly. 4 hit Tamika. She died on the way to the hospital. The third woman ducked into the floorboard and survived. But Mike wasn't done. He turned toward the crowd outside and opened fire again. Bullets hit the wall and the surrounding, almost hitting innocent people. Later that night, he went to his aunt's house and calmly said, "Theodore got my brother, and now I got his." Police had witnesses but no arrest, until a year later when 2 inmates came forward with a name. One of them claimed to be there that night. Then Erica, Mike's girlfriend, confirmed she had helped him get the rifle the day before the murders, and this sealed his faith. At trial, Mike claimed self-defense, just like Theodore had, but no one believed it. He was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and gave him 2 death sentences. But that wasn't the full story. During the trial, Mike confessed to 2 more murders and a toddler. Back in 1989, he had shot and killed his girlfriend, LaShawn Cowart, and her 2-year-old son, Travis, during an argument in a car. Then, in 1993, just 4 months before the liquor lounge shooting, he tracked down and killed his mother's abusive boyfriend, Michael Johnson. In total, Mike had left 5 people dead. He got 25 more years for the earlier killings. And for the next 30 years, he sat on death row while his attorneys fought every angle: racial bias, prosecutorial language, witness inconsistency. But none of it stuck. Every appeal failed. On Tuesday, July 15, 2025, Mike woke up at 6:30 in the morning. He had a final meal of an omelet, bacon, home fries, and a glass of orange juice. Afterward, he met with a spiritual advisor, but no one else came to visit. At 6 p.m., he was strapped to the gurney inside the execution chamber. The IV lines were inserted, and the warden stepped forward to ask if he had any last words. Mike looked up and said, "Thank you for not letting me spend the rest of my life in prison." And with that, the drugs began to flow. His chest rose once, then settled. A few minutes later, at 6:25 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Michael Bernard Bell was 54 years old. Just 2 weeks later, Edward J. Zakrzewski got executed after spending 29 years on Florida's death row. Let's go back and look at how this case unfolded. It was June 9, 1994, in the quiet town of Mary Esther, Florida. Edward was 29 years old, a technical sergeant in the U.S. Air Force, and married with 2 young kids. On the outside, he looked stable, disciplined, dependable. But that picture was already falling apart. His marriage to Sylvia was on its last legs, and he'd made threats before. Neighbors had heard him say it. If she ever tried to leave, he'd kill the whole family before letting that happen. And that morning, Edward got a call at work. His 7-year-old son, Kim, was on the line. Calmly, the boy told his father that Sylvia was filing for divorce and taking them to Korea with her. Edward said nothing. He left the base during lunch, walked into a hardware store, and bought a machete. Then he went right back to work like nothing had changed. But everything had. That night, he came home first. He hid the machete in the bathroom. Nearby, he laid out a crowbar and a rope. Then he waited. Sylvia walked through the front door, unaware her husband had turned their home into a kill zone. She sat down in the living room, exhausted. Edward came up behind her and brought the crowbar down hard, once, then again. She collapsed but didn't die. He dragged her to the bedroom and strangled her with the rope. Then he called for Kim. The boy walked in to brush his teeth. That was the routine, but this time Edward wasn't brushing his teeth. He was ending lives. He raised the machete and swung. Kim tried to block the blade with his arm, but it wasn't enough. The second swing hit his neck, and the third one hit his back. The boy collapsed and died next to the sink. Then came 5-year-old Anna. Edward lured her with the same command and hit her with the same betrayal. She tried to protect herself too. Cuts on her hands and elbows proved she saw it coming. But like her brother, she didn't stand a chance. Edward dragged Sylvia's body into the bathroom and placed her next to the children. Unsure if she was dead, he swung the machete one final time, and when he was done, he just walked out the door, drove to Orlando, flew to Hawaii, and disappeared. Under the name Michael Green, he joined a secluded religious commune and slept in a shack on a hillside like the world had never known his name. Back in Florida, silence didn't last. Edward failed to show up at work the next day. Military police filed him as AWOL, and deputies were sent to check the house. Inside, they found what he left behind: 3 bodies, blood everywhere, and a missing husband. Edward lived quietly under a false name until October 15, 1994, when Unsolved Mysteries aired an episode with his photo. The family he'd been living with saw it. Their preacher turned to him and said, "Brother Michael, that looks a lot like you." Edward said nothing. He left a note that read, "I'm sorry." 9 days later, Edward walked into a police station and turned himself in. But the question still hung in the air. What had driven him to destroy everything? 10 days after his arrest, Edward was flown back to Florida and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. In March 1996, he stood in court and confessed. Therefore, the trial moved straight to sentencing, where they asked for the death penalty on all 3 counts. On April 19, 1996, Edward received 3 death sentences. For the next 29 years, Edward sat on death row. He filed appeal after appeal, but nothing stuck. Then, on July 31st, his final day began before sunrise. Edward woke up around 5 a.m. and quietly prepared for what was coming. He was allowed one final visit, but he declined the offer to meet with a spiritual advisor. For his last meal, he ordered fried pork chops, potatoes, bacon, fried onions, toast, root beer, a slice of pie, a scoop of ice cream, and a cup of coffee to wash it all down. Later that day, Edward was led into the execution chamber and strapped to the gurney. The curtain to the witness room rose at around 6 p.m., and by then he was already covered with a white sheet. When the warden asked if he had any last words, Edward didn't hesitate. "I want to thank the good people of the Sunshine State for killing me in the most cold and calculated, clean, humane, and efficient way possible," he said. "I have no complaints whatsoever." Then, in a calm voice, he began quoting Robert Frost's famous poem, "Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening." He didn't finish the poem as his voice trailed off partway through. At 6:04 p.m., the drugs began to flow. Edward gasped a few times, his chest rising and falling in sharp jolts. But within moments, his breathing slowed. Officials pronounced him dead just 1 minute later at 6:13 p.m. Edward Zakrzewski was 60 years old. The next execution took place on August 19, 2025. After spending 43 years on death row, Cale Barrington Bates was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. But what did he do that got him on death row in the first place? On June 14, 1982, 24-year-old Janet Renee White was attacked at her office in Lynn Haven, Florida. That morning had started like any other. A slow Monday, with Renee catching her favorite soap opera on lunch break while her husband Randy made her a sandwich. At 1 p.m., she left home with a honk and a wave. Minutes later, she returned to her desk and answered the phone. On the line was her friend Geraldine Gilchrist, but the call turned into a nightmare. Renee suddenly screamed, and then the line went dead. Officers arrived within minutes, but it was too late. Her white car was still parked outside, but Renee was gone. Her body was found in the woods 50 feet behind the office. She had been beaten, stabbed repeatedly, and sexually assaulted. There was male DNA on her legs, and her wedding ring was missing. And then, from the tree line, a man emerged. Cale Barrington Bates, a delivery driver, walked out of the woods with cattails in his hand. His shirt was streaked with mud, his jeans were soaked, and there was blood on him. He claimed he was just picking plants. But when police questioned him, the lies began to pile up. At first, he denied knowing anything. Later, he claimed he stopped to ask for directions. Then he said he saw a white man attacking Renee and fled. Lastly, he said Renee had sprayed him with mace, they struggled, and she stabbed herself. He admitted trying to force himself on her, but denied stealing her ring, which they had found in his pocket. When he finally testified, he denied saying any of it. Now he claimed he slept in his truck, woke up, found the office trashed, saw her body, and ran in panic. But the jury didn't believe him. In 1983, Cale was convicted of kidnapping, armed robbery, attempted sexual battery, and first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death. After 43 years, he finally had a date, August 19, 2025. That day, Cale woke up at 5:15 a.m. Like many on death row, he had the option to request a final meal, something familiar, comforting, or symbolic. But Cale declined. He didn't want anything. Instead, he sat quietly in his cell, waiting. He had 3 visitors that morning, his daughter, his sister, and his brother-in-law. And while he could have met with a spiritual advisor before the execution, he chose not to. By 6 p.m., he was strapped to the gurney inside the Florida State Prison. Just a few feet away, Renee's husband, Randy White, sat among the witnesses, still grieving after all these years. He said justice had taken far too long. "This has just been hanging out there for 43 years, he told reporters, worried that either he or Cale might die before the execution ever happened. The execution began at 6:01 p.m. When asked if he had any final words, Cale simply said, "No." About a minute after the drugs started flowing, Cale began breathing faster, but that only lasted for a moment. Within another minute, he stopped. A few minutes later, at 6:17 p.m., he was officially pronounced dead. Cale Barrington Bates was 67 years old. The next prisoner scheduled to get executed was Curtis Wyndham, who had spent 33 years on death row. But what did he do to end up strapped to a gurney? "You're going to read about me," Curtis Wyndham said on the day that everything went south. And they did, but for all the wrong reasons. Curtis Lee Wyndham was just 26 years old on February 7, 1992, when he set off on a path that left 3 people dead before the sun went down. But for Curtis, that day wasn't the beginning. It was the breaking point, years in the making. At the center of it all was 27-year-old Valerie Davis, his on-again, off-again girlfriend, and the mother of their 9-month-old daughter. At the time, Valerie lived with her mother, Mary Lubin, who had been just 14 when Valerie was born. Curtis also had a best friend, 23-year-old Johnny Lee, who owed Curtis $2,000 in drug money. And worse, there were rumors swirling that Johnny was seeing Valerie behind Curtis's back. And that February morning, everything boiled over. A man named Jack Luckett told Curtis that Johnny had just walked away from the dog track with a small payout, just $114. It wasn't much, but to Curtis, it felt like a slap in the face. He lost it, looked at Jack and said, "You're going to read about me." By noon that day, he had purchased a handgun, shot and killed his best friend Johnny Lee in public, gunned down his ex-girlfriend Valerie Davis in her apartment, and fatally shot Valerie's mother, Mary Lubin, at an intersection. He also shot Kenneth Williams, whom he suspected of being a police informant. But Kenneth survived after a month in the hospital. Witnesses were everywhere, and Curtis was arrested later that same day. In November 1992, a jury unanimously recommended the death penalty, and the judge sentenced Curtis to death for each of the 3 murders and added 22 years for the attempted murder of Kenneth. Curtis's final appeal for a stay was rejected on August 27, 2025, and one day later, his final day came. He woke up at 5 a.m. knowing the clock had run out. Officials later said he seemed in good spirits, but he had no visitors on his last day. For his last meal, he requested ribs, baked beans, collard greens, potato salad, and a slice of pie. When the curtain rose, Curtis was already strapped to the gurney, a white sheet pulled up to his chin. Moments later, at 6 p.m., the sedative began to flow. Curtis mumbled something about being on death row. He took a long, deliberate breath, then another. His chest rose and fell. His legs twitched several times, and then he went still. At 6:17 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Curtis Wyndham was 59 years old. On September 17, 2025, the next execution took place. This time, David Pittman was facing execution after spending 32 years on death row. On May 15, 1990, at around 2:30 in the morning, 28-year-old David Pittman slipped out of his house and started the short half-mile walk toward his soon-to-be ex-family-in-law's home. He told himself he only wanted to talk, but somewhere along that quiet stretch of road, he already knew it wasn't going to end that way. The night air was still, but inside his head it was boiling. When he reached the house, he crept to the side, climbed the fence near the shed, and tapped on Bonnie Jo Knoll's window. At first, it almost looked like a conversation. He sat down and told her how her family was making things worse, how he felt cornered. He brought up the 1985 allegation, the accusation she'd made when she was just 15 and asked why she had told them. Bonnie Jo stood her ground, reminded him of what happened, but David's mood shifted again. He started picking at her life, questioning her mental health, and then asked if she wanted to have sex. She said no, she was on her period. But he kept pressing, suggesting oral stories, anything to wear her down. Finally, she'd had enough and told him to leave. Instead, he lunged. He clamped his hand over her mouth to stop her screams, struck her hard, then snapped. He slashed her throat and stabbed her over and over until she went still. The attack wasn't quiet. Her mother, Barbara, jolted awake and rushed into the hallway. David stepped out and drove the knife into her, too. Clarence Knowles heard the screams, ran for the phone, but David was faster. Before Clarence could call for help, David beat him down and stabbed him until he collapsed by the hallway telephone. In minutes, 3 members of the Knowles family were dead. But David didn't run. He needed time. He poured gasoline through the house, shoved a tire under Bonnie Jo's bed to make it burn hotter, washed the blood from himself, then grabbed Bonnie's keys and fled in her car. Behind him, the home caught fire, and within seconds, flames were ripping across the roof. By 3:36 a.m., a newspaper delivery man spotted the blaze and called 911. Firefighters arrived at 3:42 to find half the roof blown away and the interior gutted. In Bonnie Jo's room, the destruction was worst of all. The tire under her bed had turned it into an inferno. But the autopsy told the truth. Bonnie Jo had been stabbed 8 times, Barbara 3, and Clarence 5. None of them had breathed in smoke. They were dead before the fire. At 6:30 that morning, a construction worker saw a brown Toyota stuck in a ditch less than a mile from the Knowles home. Moments later, a man set it on fire. A neighbor saw the same thing, smoke rising, a man running. When police showed them a lineup, they both picked David Pittman without hesitation. The car fire, like the house fire, was no accident. It was a final attempt to erase the evidence. By sunrise, investigators knew exactly who they were looking for. His trial began in 1991, 1 year after Clarence, Barbara, and Bonnie were found dead inside their burning home. And by November 1991, the verdict was in. The jury found him guilty on every count except burglary. 32 years later, his final day came. He woke up at 5:45 a.m. under the same cold lights that had marked every day on death row. Hours later, he sat down for his final meal, steak, chicken, and biscuits. Then, just before 6 p.m., they strapped him to the gurney. When asked if he had any final words, David didn't hesitate. "I know you all came to watch an innocent man be murdered by the state of Florida. I am innocent. I didn't kill anybody. That's it," he said. The execution moved forward without any complications. At 6:12 p.m., he was pronounced dead. David Joseph Pittman was 63 years old. Next up was Victor Tony Jones, who spent 32 years on death row. But what did he do to end up there? On the morning of December 19, 1990, everything at Jacob and Matilda Nestor's small Miami business looked normal from the outside. Their daughter Irene had spoken with them just after 10 a.m., a routine check-in that felt light and ordinary. Even when Matilda called back to chat a little longer, there was no sign of what was about to happen. By noon, though, the calls stopped. A UPS driver arrived for a delivery and found the doors locked, the blinds drawn, and through the mail slot, a glimpse of papers scattered and dark stains on the floor. Alarmed, he ran next door to get help from Ernesto Sorondo, a neighbor who knew the Nestors, and also knew they had just hired a new worker, 29-year-old Victor Jones, the day before. When police forced the door open, the tidy office had become a crime scene. Jacob lay dead on the office floor from stab wounds to the chest. Matilda was in the bathroom, face down and stabbed between the shoulder blades. Her blood streaked across the wall where she'd collapsed. But the killer hadn't fled. Slumped on the couch, a leather jacket pulled across his chest, sat Victor. Blood speckled his sneakers and pants. Beneath his arm was Jacob's loaded pistol, cocked and ready to fire. Officers shouted for him to show his hands. Slowly, he raised them and surrendered. Inside the chaos, evidence told the story. Jacob had fought back, his forehead cut open as he tried to defend himself, pulling out the knife and firing 5 rounds before collapsing. Victor had been grazed by one of the bullets but stayed inside, locking the door and waiting. In his pockets were the Nestor's wallets, keys, and Matilda's purse. His fingerprints hovered above her body on the bathroom wall. Even before detectives questioned him, Victor began to talk. At the hospital, he told a nurse, "I killed those people. They owed me money, and I had to kill them." Victor's trial began in 1992. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of armed robbery. On March 1, 1993, Victor was sentenced to death for each victim. In addition, he was given consecutive life sentences for the 2 robbery convictions. Victor kept fighting the sentence for decades, filing appeal after appeal, but every court upheld the original verdict. On the morning of his execution, Victor woke up at 4:30 a.m. He met briefly with a spiritual advisor but didn't receive any other visitors, according to a spokesperson for the Department of Corrections. When it came time for his final meal, he asked for fried chicken, collard greens, and sweet tea. The execution proceeded without any reported issues. When asked for his final words, he simply replied, "No, sir." After the drugs were administered, a guard followed standard protocol, and he showed no response. At 6:17 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Victor Tony Jones was 64 years old. The next execution was scheduled for October 14, 2025, when Samuel Lee Smithers was executed after 36 years on death row. It started as a simple favor. In 1995, Sam agreed to mow the grass at a vacant property owned by a schoolteacher named Marion Whitehurst. For a year, nothing seemed unusual, until Marion stopped by unannounced on May 28, 1996. She found Sam wiping down an axe next to a pool of blood near the carport, and she noticed drag marks leading toward a pond. Sam said the blood was probably from a small animal, but Marion didn't believe him. That night, she called the sheriff. When deputies arrived, the blood was gone, but 2 bodies floated in the pond, Christy Cowan and Denise Roach. The evidence stacked up fast. Christy's blood was found in the carport, Sam's fingerprint inside the house, and his shoe prints matched those by the pond. Surveillance video showed him with Christy just hours before she died. When questioned, Sam claimed Christy had threatened him and that things got out of hand, and he said that Denise's death had been an accident. But autopsies told another story. Both women had been strangled, beaten, and dumped into the same pond. It wasn't rage or panic. It was deliberate. At trial, Sam changed his story again, saying he was blackmailed and blamed a mysterious Mr. X for the killings, but the jury didn't buy it. They saw 2 women from the same institution area murdered the same way by the same man. After a short deliberation, all 12 jurors voted for death. He would spend the next 36 years on death row. Then, on October 14, 2025, time finally caught up. Samuel woke up at 6:30 a.m., and officials later said he was compliant. He didn't ask for a spiritual advisor and had no visitors. But he did request one special final meal: fried chicken, fried fish, apple pie, and a scoop of ice cream. At exactly 6 p.m., the curtain to the death chamber went up. Sam was already strapped to the gurney with an IV line in his arm. When asked if he had any final words, Sam simply said, "No, sir." No apology, no explanation, nothing. The warden gave the signal and the drugs began to flow. At first, his chest rose and fell heavily, and his body tensed with brief convulsions, but within moments, all movement stopped. His skin gradually turned gray as the minutes ticked by, and at 6:14 p.m., a medic entered the chamber to check for signs of life. 1 minute later, Sam was officially pronounced dead. Samuel Lee Smithers was 72 years old. Norman Merle Grimm was the next prisoner in line. After 25 years, he got executed. But what for? It all started early on July 27, 1998. Around 5 a.m., deputies responded to a disturbance call at Cynthia Campbell's home in Pensacola. They found Cynthia barefoot in a nightgown, standing on the porch with her neighbor, Norman Grimm, who was only wearing cut-off jeans. There was a broken window, scattered glass, and a lug nut in the grass, but nothing that screamed danger. Right before the deputy left, Norman asked Cynthia to come over to his place for coffee, and everyone went their separate ways. But just hours later, Cynthia's co-workers reported her missing, and the police started asking questions to the neighbors, including Norman. But they didn't know that he had already killed her. He beat Cynthia with a hammer, stabbed her 11 times, 7 times through her heart, and then wrapped her in bedsheets, a shower curtain, masking tape, and black trash bags. He hid the body in his car trunk and calmly spoke with officers as they searched for her. By early afternoon, he drove to the Pensacola Bay Bridge, popped the trunk, and threw her body into the water. But she didn't stay missing for long. Just after 3:30 p.m., a fisherman and his young son hooked her body under the bridge. Wrapped in sheets and plastic, it surfaced like a horror no one saw coming. When detectives pulled the green carpet from her remains, one officer recognized it immediately. It was identical to the one he saw at Norman's back porch that very morning. Everything clicked, and by nightfall, a warrant was issued. Inside Norman's house, investigators found blood-soaked mops, Cynthia's fingerprints on a coffee cup, blood-stained trash bags, and the hammer and knife used to kill her hidden inside a cooler. But Norman was nowhere to be found. Just 3 days later, U.S. Marshals caught him in Oklahoma, and at trial, the evidence was crushing. His DNA was on the hammer, the knife, and the shorts he wore that morning. Her blood trailed across his kitchen floor. The state called it a brutal, calculated act. And Norman didn't deny it. He didn't even ask for mercy either. He asked to be killed. He refused to let his lawyers argue for life, and he wouldn't allow a single witness or plea for leniency. Even after the court appointed special counsel to look into his mental health and childhood trauma, Norman stayed silent. He wanted no defense, just death. In December 2000, the judge sentenced him to die for murder and added 390 months for sexual battery. And 25 years later, he finally got a date, October 28, 2025. Then his final day came. On the morning of his execution, Norman woke up around 6 a.m. Later that afternoon, he was served his final meal: fried pork chops, mashed potatoes, a chocolate milkshake, and a slice of pie. At exactly 6 p.m., the curtain to the death chamber went up. Norman lay strapped to the gurney, one arm stretched out with an IV already in place. When asked if he wanted to give a final statement, he kept his voice low and flat. "No, sir." Roughly a minute later, the injection began. Norman closed his eyes and drew in a few heavy breaths. His body twitched slightly, then stopped moving altogether. At 6:13 p.m., a medic entered to check his vitals, and 1 minute later, Norman was declared dead. Norman Merle Grimm was 65 years old. The next execution took place on November 13, 2025, when Brian Jennings was executed after 45 years on death row. But what did he do to end up there? Just before dawn on May 11, 1979, 6-year-old Rebecca Kunash slept in her room, her costume for the first-grade play waiting on a chair. Her parents were asleep down the hall, unaware that someone was watching their house from the dark. 20-year-old Brian Jennings, home on leave from the Marines, had been drinking that night and drifted through the neighborhood like he often did. When he saw the soft nightlight glowing through Becky's window, he stopped. And this time, he didn't walk away. He slipped out the screen, crawled inside, and lifted Becky from her bed before she even opened her eyes. Brian carried her to his car and drove her to a secluded canal on Merritt Island. There, the violence exploded. He assaulted her with such force that both had visible injuries, then slammed her against the ground hard enough to fracture her skull. But Becky was still alive when he dragged her to the water and forced her head under the surface until she stopped fighting. Then he left her in the canal, alone in the dark. A fisherman found her body floating that morning. Within hours, detectives realized the killer had climbed through her window, and the fingerprints left behind matched the young Marine they had just booked on an unrelated traffic stop. By the next day, Brian cracked during interrogation. His voice stayed flat as he described taking Becky, assaulting her, and drowning her. He even drew maps and sketches with details only the killer could know. Then the case moved fast. His confession without lawyer was ruled voluntary, and at trial the jury heard it in full, Brian calmly recounting every step. Fingerprint experts tied him to the window. A cellmate testified he had bragged about the killing, and a psychiatrist told jurors Brian wasn't delusional or confused. He knew exactly what he was doing. His lawyers pointed to a chaotic childhood, an absent father, unstable home, behavioral problems, and a young life shaped by neglect. But none of it outweighed what happened at that canal. On February 7, 1980, Brian was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual battery, and the jury sentenced him to die on May 7, 1980. Then, on October 10, 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis finally signed his death warrant, scheduling Brian's execution for November 13th. Becky would have been 53 years old by then. Instead, she never made it past 6. On the morning of his execution, Brian woke before sunrise, around 4 a.m. He ate his final meal later that day, a cheeseburger, fries, and a soda. No one came to see him that day. According to prison officials, he spent his final hours alone. Just before 6 p.m., he was led to the execution chamber. When asked if he had any final words, Brian responded with a firm no. He didn't offer an apology, not to the victim's family or to anyone else in the room. As the drugs began to flow, his chest lifted sharply and his arms twitched against the gurney. For a few minutes, the movement continued, but then it stopped. His body fell still, with his mouth hanging open. He was pronounced dead at 6:20 p.m. Brian Frederick Jennings was 66 years old. 1 week later, Richard Barry Randolph was executed after spending 36 years on death row. But what did he do? It was just after sunrise on August 15, 1988, when the first customers pulled into the Handyway parking lot. The lights were on, but the doors were still locked. Something didn't feel right. Minnie Ruth McCollum always opened on time. Instead, they saw Richard Randolph step out wearing a store smock, casually locking the front door. When the Patilla sisters asked where Minnie was, he smiled and said her car had broken down, that she had taken his to get it fixed, and he was heading out to pick her up. Then he climbed into Minnie's own car and drove off. But when the women pressed their faces to the glass, they believed nothing of what he just said. The counter was torn apart, the ceiling camera was ripped out, and the backroom door, which was always open, was nearly shut. They immediately called the sheriff. Deputies forced their way inside, and behind that half-closed door, they found Minnie on the floor, barely alive. Blood pooled under her, and a knife lay near her head. She was breathing, but she couldn't speak. Paramedics fought to keep her alive, and while they worked, Richard was long gone. He drove straight to his girlfriend's house and told her everything. He said he robbed the store and that he hurt Minnie. Then he grabbed the stolen lottery tickets and left for Jacksonville, promising he would return so they could run off together. But detectives already knew where to look. Richard had worked at that Handyway. He knew about the safe, the schedule, the routine, and by the next morning, they tracked him down outside a Save-A-Lot. When they confronted him, he didn't run. He talked. Richard's trial began in April 1989. Prosecutors laid out the evidence, his confession, the stolen car, the discarded clothes, the DNA, and the trail of tickets he cached along the highway. But the full weight came during sentencing. Minnie survived for 6 days before her body gave out. Doctors described injuries so severe they compared them to high-speed crashes. The defense pointed to his abusive childhood and crack addiction, claiming he acted out of desperation. But the jury didn't buy it. He was found guilty and sentenced to death on April 5, 1989. And after 36 years, a date was finally set, November 20th, 2025. That morning, Richard woke up at 6:30 a.m. Later that day, he was given his final meal, which included a cheeseburger, fries, and ice cream. Richard had one visitor, but did not meet with a spiritual advisor. Just before 6 p.m., he was strapped to the gurney. A prison guard leaned in and asked if he had any last words, but Richard simply said, "No." No apology, no explanation, nothing at all. Moments later, the drugs began to flow. The process moved forward without complications, and at 6:12 p.m., Richard was officially pronounced dead. Richard Barry Randolph was 63 years old. The next in line was Mark Geralds, who spent 35 years on death row. But what did he do? Just after 3:15 p.m. on February 1st, 1989, 8-year-old Bart Pettibone came home and sensed something was wrong. The driveway was empty and the house looked too still. Inside the kitchen, he found a scene he couldn't understand. His mother, 33-year-old Tressa Pettibone, lay bound and bleeding on the floor. Moments later, a family friend arrived with Bart's sister, and one look inside sent her rushing the children back out the door. By the time police arrived, the quiet home had become a crime scene, blood on the floor, a knife rinsed and left in the sink, and signs of a struggle that spoke to a violent fight for survival. Detectives quickly realized that multiple things were missing: jewelry Tressa wore every day, her red Gucci sunglasses, and her car. Yet there were no broken locks, no forced entry. Whoever had walked into that home knew exactly where to go. Their focus soon tightened on a familiar name, 20-year-old Mark Geralds, a carpenter who had worked in the Pettibones' home the year before. A chance meeting at the mall days earlier had given him something he needed: confirmation that Tressa's husband was out of town, and a chance to quietly ask Bart when the house was empty each morning. And when Tressa's jewelry began turning up in pawn shops just hours after the murder, with Mark's name on the tickets and blood matching her type on a necklace, the picture became clear. Shoe prints matched his Nikes. Zip ties like those around Tressa's wrists were found in his home and car, and friends said he'd suddenly given away a pair of red sunglasses eerily similar to hers. By February 3rd, police arrested him for murder, robbery, and burglary. In court, the state said his motive was simple: money. He knew Tressa was alone, they argued, and when she resisted, the robbery turned into a killing marked by planning and control. His defense countered with a portrait of a troubled young man who panicked, insisting he hadn't gone there intending to kill, pointing out that the knife came from her own kitchen. But the jury didn't buy it. After only a few hours, they convicted him of first-degree murder, and on April 17, 1990, the judge sentenced Mark Allen Geralds to die in Florida's electric chair. Then, in 2025, the fight was finally over when the Florida Supreme Court signed his death warrant. He was scheduled to die on December 9, 2025. That morning, Mark woke up at 5:45 a.m. inside Florida State Prison. Like every inmate facing execution, he was given the option to request a special final meal, but he turned it down. Just before 6 p.m., he was led to the execution chamber. When asked if he had any final words, Mark spoke directly to someone in the viewing room. "I'm sorry that I missed you," he said softly. Then he added, "I loved you every day." No one was sure exactly who he was speaking to, but his words hung in the room with a quiet weight. When the injection began, he took several deep breaths, his chest rising and falling as the drugs took effect. There were a few moments of slight movement, small twitches, his mouth opening and closing. And then he gradually grew still. Within 3 to 4 minutes, Mark showed no further movement. He was pronounced dead at 6:15 p.m. Mark Allen Geralds was 58 years old. Let's continue with the last person executed in 2025. On December 18, 2025, after spending more than 37 years on death row, Frank Athen Walls was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But what led him to death row? Let's take a look. It all began in the early morning hours of July 22, 1987, at a mobile home park in Ocean City, Florida. Inside a modest trailer, 22-year-old Edward Alger, an airman stationed at Glen Air Force Base, and his girlfriend, 20-year-old Ann Louise Peterson, were sound asleep. His neighbor, 19-year-old Frank Athen Walls, quietly broke into their home. But he wasn't trying to stay hidden. Once inside, he intentionally knocked over a fan, making just enough noise to wake them up. When Edward and Ann stumbled out to check the noise, they found themselves face to face with an intruder armed with a knife and a gun. Frank forced Ann to tie up Edward's hands and ankles with rope, then did the same to her. But Edward managed to loosen his bindings and lunged at Frank, trying to overpower him. The two men struggled until Frank pulled out a gun and fired 3 shots into Edward's head. Then he raped Ann and shot her twice. Before he left, he grabbed $200 in cash, a worn leather wallet, and the fan as his trophy. Then he walked out, leaving behind 2 bodies and a scene that would haunt investigators for decades. After the news about the murders broke, Frank's roommate called the police and told them to look into him. He had been growing uneasy about Frank's behavior as he had been talking about dark, violent fantasies, raping and killing people recently. The next day, the police arrested Frank. When detectives searched his trailer, they found an arsenal of weapons, ice picks, knives, 9.22 caliber pistols, a hatchet, a chainsaw, burnt boots, and bloody jeans. They also found the stolen fan, wallet, and cash, along with 2 other fans, 4 telephones, and 2 lawnmowers. During questioning, Frank immediately admitted responsibility for the murders. But investigators suspected there was more to the story, and they were right. As they dug deeper, a disturbing pattern emerged. Frank had been killing for years. When he was just 17, he killed Tommy Lou Whidden while she was sunbathing on the beach. A year later, on September 16, 1986, he stabbed 24-year-old Cynthia Sue Condra 21 times and left her body on the side of a road. And just 2 months before the murders on Edward and Ann, he broke into a mobile home and killed 47-year-old Audrey Gigi. After Frank's arrest, investigators found a fan in his trailer with Audrey's fingerprint on it. Frank was sentenced to death for Ann Peterson's murder and life imprisonment with a chance of parole after 25 years for Edward Alger's murder. Later, the police were looking at Frank for the murder of 35-year-old Lindsay Sams, who had been beaten to death in October 1986. But this time, he refused to say a word. For years, the suspicion hovered. But over time, investigators shifted their attention toward Mark Reeb, the stepfather of Frank's girlfriend at that time. Neither Mark nor Frank was ever charged in Lindsay's case, and her murder remains frozen in that same place it had been since 1986. But while Lindsay's case remained unsolved, Frank's story was moving toward its end. After decades of trials, retrials, and failed appeals, his time ran out. The legal road he had traveled for years came to a stop. And at last, the state set a date. Frank's execution was scheduled for December 18, 2025. That morning, Frank woke up at 5:10 a.m. and remained calm and compliant throughout the day. For his final meal, he requested chicken, steak, a baked potato, and cheesecake. He later met with one visitor and a spiritual advisor. In the days leading up to his execution, Frank's faith was unshakable. He explained it in simple terms. Either the Lord will grant me a stay and let me live to continue to spread His word, or the Lord will welcome me home. Then the moment came. Frank was strapped to the gurney and asked if he had any final words. He paused, then thanked the execution team for allowing him to speak. "Good evening, everyone," he said. "I appreciate the opportunity to say what's on my heart. If any members of the family are here, I am sorry for all of the things I did, the pain I caused, and all of that you have suffered all these years." Moments later, the process began. A priest stood at his side, holding his hand. Throughout it all, the priest prayed softly. At first, Frank's breathing was heavy, but as time passed, it gradually slowed and grew calm. At 6:11 p.m., a physician entered the room. He checked Frank's eyes, then listened carefully for a heartbeat. After a brief pause, he stepped back and spoke the words that marked the end. The execution had been carried out. Frank Athen Walls was 58 years old. These were all the prisoners executed in Florida in 2025. What do you think about this record-breaking year? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.